I used to believe winter was the cruelest thing in St. Paul, the way it chews through bone and pride. Then I walked under the Wabasha Street Bridge one brittle morning and found my son Daniel curled around his little boy, both of them hidden under a gray blanket that smelled like damp cardboard. For 3 years I had pictured them strolling through bright European streets. In that single breath, the picture shattered. But when Mason opened his eyes and smiled at me, hope crashed through the cold like sunlight. My name is Evelyn Hart. I am 68 years old, a retired seamstress who learned to turn scraps into something worth wearing. I live alone in a small house that once rattled with the sound of kids slamming doors and a husband hollering about dinner. Age quieted it all. I fill the evenings with radio chatter and the soft hum of my sewing machine. On that morning, I had a thermos of coffee, a bag of muffins, and a stubborn habit of walking the river trail while the city rubbed its eyes awake. I saw the blanket first, a lump by the concrete pillar, a child's sneaker poking out in stubborn blue. Then I heard Daniel's voice, low and rough, telling Mason it was time to get up and find a warm place. There was something about his tone that grabbed me, the way a mother knows a cry in a crowded room. I said, "Daniel," and the world tilted. He sat up too fast, thinner than I remembered. Cheekbones sharp, beard scraggly, eyes full of shame. Mason blinked at me like a fawn caught in headlights, then reached for Daniel's sleeve. A long time ago, Sabrina told me they were leaving for Europe. A fresh start, jobs lined up, a school for Mason with art and music and language classes. She said they would never come back because the neighborhood gossiped and dragged them down. I believed enough to swallow my doubts. I have known silent abuse in beautiful words, how it slides past your boundaries while smiling. I had seen signs in Sabrina, the way she pinched Daniel's pride until it bruised, the way she measured love in favors and me in money. I used to joke I was turning into an ATM mother. It was not a joke. Seeing them there, something hot and sharp rose in me, but I kept my voice steady. I poured coffee into the cup from my thermos and handed it to Daniel. His hands trembled. I unwrapped a muffin and gave it to Mason. He ate carefully, like he had learned to make each bite last. I knelt on the cold concrete and said, "Come home." Daniel opened his mouth to refuse. The word formed and died. His face crumpled. He nodded once. On the walk back, the city stirred awake. Buses sighed at corners, joggers thumped past with their winter chins tucked into fleece. I kept my shoulders square and my eyes forward, because dignity is sometimes how you carry your pain in public. Mason held my gloved hand and told me the names of bridges, which were all wrong and perfect, like he had mapped his own small kingdom beneath the roads where no one looked. Daniel lagged a step behind. I knew that step. It belonged to regret. My house smelled like quilting cotton and cinnamon. I set out blankets, ran the bath until steam softened the mirrors, laid a pair of my old sweatshirts on the bed. Daniel tried to apologize to the air, to the floorboards, to whatever power listens to men who have fallen farther than they thought possible. I told him to sleep. He stood there with damp hair and hollow eyes and said, "Ma, I sold everything for a lie." I reached up and touched his cheek like he was 8 years old and scraped from a bike fall. I said, "You are here. That's the truth we get to keep." Mason found one of my toy-sized pin cushions, shaped like a strawberry, and pressed it to his palm as if it were a secret egg. He told me he liked the red. He asked, "Do we have to leave in the morning?" I said, "No." Sometimes the most generous word in the American language is that simple. No. We are not leaving. No. This is not how it ends. No. We will not let betrayal define us. That afternoon, the house did something I had not heard in years. It took a deep breath and changed shape to hold 3 hearts again. The fridge hummed louder. The floorboards learned the rhythm of small feet. I put on a pot of chicken soup and set 3 bowls on the table. It felt like an act of courage I had been rehearsing without knowing. People like to imagine family tragedies arrive as explosions. Mine arrived as a text that seemed like a promise, and then 3 winters of silence, and then a blanket under a bridge. There are ungrateful children in this world, and there is family betrayal that makes your teeth ache. But I have also learned that inner strength sits quietly until you ask it to stand up. I had spent years claiming freedom without enforcing boundaries. That morning, I chose both. Respect for my son did not mean excusing his mistakes. Self-care did not mean closing my door. I was ready to put an end to the lies that starved us and start again. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I love hearing how far these stories travel. 3 years earlier, the house still smelled like Sunday pancakes and Mason's crayons. Daniel had a steady job repairing bikes at a local shop, and Sabrina was restless, always talking about how small St. Paul felt, how people there never made it. She scrolled through travel photos on her phone while folding laundry, her eyes shining with hunger for another life. I used to listen from the kitchen, pretending to clean the counter, feeling the chill in her voice every time she mentioned Europe. She had a way of making dreams sound like deadlines. "We could sell the house, Daniel," she said one evening, her fingers tracing circles on the table. "Start fresh. No more debt, no more small-town gossip." He hesitated. Of course he did. He was a good man, cautious and gentle. But Sabrina knew how to mix guilt and charm until he confused one for the other. She told him he was holding Mason back by staying in a dead city. I remember hearing her words through the thin walls and wanting to storm in and defend him, but I bit my tongue. Parents are supposed to let their children choose. Within a month, she had convinced him to list the house. They sold the car, too. I watched the moving truck pull away with everything they owned and told myself this was progress. Daniel hugged me at the door, smelling of aftershave and excitement. Sabrina gave me a tight smile and said, "We'll send pictures from London." Mason waved his superhero backpack at me and shouted, "Grandma, I'll bring you chocolate from Europe." I laughed through the lump in my throat. At first, the messages came regularly, short updates, blurry photos of what looked like airports, rented rooms, new beginnings. Then they stopped. When I tried calling, the number no longer worked. Weeks passed, then months. I wrote letters to the address she had given me, but they returned unopened. Daniel's birthday came and went, Mason's too. Silence settled over the house, like dust you can't sweep away. I went to the police once, but they said adults have the right to disappear. "He's probably fine, ma'am," the officer said, smiling too easily. I walked home in the snow, my feet numb, my mind repeating that sentence, "Probably fine." It became my prayer and my curse. Neighbors asked questions I couldn't answer. My friends from church suggested faith. But even faith needs a place to land. I started sewing late into the night, patching old denim, hemming skirts for neighbors, anything to drown out the ache. Each stitch was a heartbeat, each garment a silent message. Come home. One winter night, Sabrina sent a single email. The subject line read, "Don't look for us." She wrote that they were happy in Europe, that Daniel had found a new job, and Mason was learning French. She said they would not return because the past belongs to those who never risk anything. I remember staring at that line, feeling both insulted and relieved. I printed the email and taped it inside my recipe book, as if proof of their happiness could feed me. A year later, a woman from the bank called. She said Daniel's account was empty, that the house sale had been transferred entirely to Sabrina's name. My chest tightened. It was the first time I let myself wonder if love can be a kind of theft. Sometimes I saw couples on the street and thought I glimpsed her face in the crowd, laughing, radiant, untouched by consequence. Other times, I imagined Daniel beside her, too tired to protest, carrying her shopping bags through cobblestone alleys. I didn't know that by then he was already back in the United States, living quietly in shelters, searching for work no one would give him because his identification had been stolen, his credit ruined, his confidence erased. It took me a long time to understand that Sabrina's betrayal wasn't just about money. It was about control, the slow, silent abuse that convinces a person they deserve less than they once dreamed of. Daniel had always wanted to make things with his hands. He used to fix torn pockets for his friends, make kites for Mason out of old grocery bags. Sabrina had turned that tenderness into shame. When I think back, I wish I had done more. I wish I had told Daniel that freedom isn't leaving. It's staying true to yourself even when someone calls your life small. I wish I had said that loyalty without respect is just fear wearing perfume. But guilt is a useless garment. It keeps you warm only in the dark. The day I found them under that bridge, I finally understood the full shape of her betrayal. Every lie she told had been stitched into their clothes, their hearts, their silence. And as much as it broke me, there was relief in the truth. Lies scatter like feathers in the wind, but truth lands heavy and stays. Daniel slept for nearly 2 days after I brought him home. Mason kept drifting between rooms, following me with wide eyes, as if afraid I might disappear too. The first morning he woke, I found him sitting at the kitchen table drawing pictures of bridges. "That's where we lived," he said softly. "Daddy said it was just until we found our own house." I told him that sometimes people start over in strange places, but it does not mean they stop being family. He smiled, but I saw how thin his wrists were, how gently he handled the pencil, like even paper could break him. Daniel came out of the guest room on the 3rd day, pale and quiet, wearing one of my old flannel shirts. He stood at the kitchen doorway, not knowing whether to sit or apologize first. I placed a plate of eggs and toast in front of him and said, "Eat before you say anything foolish." He laughed, a small sound that cracked halfway. When he finished eating, he whispered, "I don't know how to start again, Ma." I told him he already had. The first week felt like learning a new rhythm. My house, once filled only with radio voices and the tick of the clock, now pulsed with footsteps, dishes clinking, and Mason's soft singing in the living room. Daniel tried to help by sweeping the porch, fixing a loose hinge, scrubbing the bathtub until his hands were raw. He was desperate to repay something, anything. I kept telling him that sheltering your child is not a debt, it is a duty. But shame is stubborn. It does not listen easily. On the 4th night, I heard him crying in the laundry room. I stood outside the door, unsure whether to enter. He was whispering to himself, saying he had ruined everything, that Sabrina was right about him being weak. I pushed the door open and said, "Weak men don't survive 3 winters on the street with a child." "You did." He looked up, eyes red, and nodded, though I could see he did not believe me yet. Mason, on the other hand, began to bloom. He followed me into the sewing room, watching the needle glide through fabric. I let him press the pedal once or twice, his small foot trembling with excitement. He said he wanted to make a jacket for the dog he had found under the bridge. The animal was nothing more than skin and bones, but he carried it in his arms like treasure. I told him love can make broken things strong again. He asked, "Like Daddy?" And I said yes. Neighbors started to notice. Some offered help, others offered gossip, disguised as concern. I kept my answers brief. "Family needed me," I said. That's all. I refused to let pity stick to us. Dignity is not about pride. It's about quiet courage when the world expects your silence. One afternoon, I took Mason to register at the local elementary school. The secretary smiled at him and said they had an opening in 4th grade. He clutched my hand and whispered, "I don't have good shoes." I told him, "Shoes can wait. You walk in with your heart first." That night I polished his sneakers with furniture oil until they shone. Daniel began helping around the sewing table. At first, he only cut threads or organized spools by color. Then, one evening, I saw him take a piece of fabric and line up the edges with surprising precision. "Remember how you taught me to mend my jeans?" he asked. I nodded. He stitched a small patch, the seam perfectly straight. There was something healing in that motion, the way the needle entered and left, like breathing. I started leaving small projects for him, a button to reattach, a hem to shorten. He finished them quietly, and each time his shoulders seemed a little less heavy. It was not the work that saved him, but the rhythm of usefulness, the slow rebuilding of dignity through his hands. At night, after Mason fell asleep, we would sit at the kitchen table with tea. Daniel told me fragments of what had happened after Sabrina left him, how she took the last of their money and vanished, how he searched for her, sleeping in bus stations, holding Mason close while pretending it was an adventure. How he stopped believing in rescue. I listened without interrupting. Sometimes silence is the most respectful kind of love. Before bed, I checked on Mason one last time. He slept curled around the dog, the blanket rising and falling with their shared breath. Watching them, I thought of how quickly a family can break and how quietly it can begin to heal. The house felt alive again, not perfect, but human. As I turned off the light, Daniel's voice came from the doorway. "Ma," he said, "thank you for finding us." I told him, "You were never lost, just waiting to be found." The next morning, Daniel woke before sunrise and tried to leave quietly. I heard the door creak and called out his name. He froze, then sighed, caught like a teenager sneaking out. "I was just going to look for work," he said. I walked to the kitchen, poured coffee, and handed him a mug. "Work will find you when you stop running from yourself," I told him. He smiled weakly but stayed. It was not pride that kept him from asking for help. It was humiliation. In our neighborhood, news traveled faster than wind, and everyone remembered how Sabrina had posted photos of her new European life. They whispered that Daniel must have done something terrible to deserve being left behind. That kind of gossip can bruise deeper than fists. I tried to ignore the neighbors' glances, but Daniel noticed them every time we walked to the corner store. He lowered his head, pretending to tie Mason's shoelaces just to avoid their eyes. One afternoon, a woman from church stopped by with a casserole and said, "It's brave of you to take him back after everything." I smiled politely, though the words stung. After everything, as if compassion required permission. Daniel spent his days repairing small things, my old radio, the squeaky back door, a lamp with a broken switch. It was as if fixing objects gave him permission to believe broken people could be mended too. Sometimes I caught him staring at the sewing machine, lost in thought. When I asked what he was thinking, he said, "I wish I had something to offer." I answered, "You have hands, a mind, and a heart. That's a full toolbox." At night, he ate dinner silently, the air thick with the weight of unspoken gratitude and shame. Mason chattered about school, proudly showing drawings and spelling tests. Daniel smiled, but his eyes were distant, fixed on a life he used to have. I understood that kind of ache. I had felt it after my husband passed, when the silence at the table became its own kind of noise. I began giving Daniel small sewing tasks, pretending it was just to keep him busy. He mended a tear in one of Mason's jackets. The stitches were uneven but strong. I praised him as if he had built a bridge. That small act lit something behind his eyes. He asked for more fabric. Soon he was patching jeans for neighbors who didn't mind paying a few dollars. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Still, the shame lingered. One evening, while folding laundry, he said, "Ma, maybe I should move out. People talk." I looked at him, hands trembling from holding too many regrets, and said, "Let them talk. The truth doesn't need defense. It just needs time." He stared at me for a long moment and then nodded. Mason, meanwhile, adapted faster than either of us expected. Children have a strange gift for making the present enough. He befriended a neighbor's boy, traded baseball cards, learned to ride a bike we found at a garage sale. His laughter filled the house again. It became our best medicine. But the nights were still hard. Sometimes Daniel would wake from nightmares, shouting her name, clutching at his chest. I would sit beside him, waiting until his breathing slowed. He never remembered the dreams, only the feeling of falling. I understood. Betrayal has no shape, but it has weight. A few weeks later, I overheard Mason telling a friend that his dad used to be rich until a bad woman stole everything. My first instinct was to hush him, to protect Daniel's dignity. But then I stopped. The boy wasn't spreading shame. He was naming truth. Children speak it before adults learn to hide it. One evening, as we were closing the curtains, Daniel said, "Maybe I can help you with orders, if you show me how to use the machine." My heart almost burst. It was the first time he had asked for something that wasn't forgiveness. I showed him where to thread the needle, how to guide the fabric slowly, to listen for the steady rhythm. His hands trembled at first, But by the second line of stitches, the movement became smoother. I watched him, proud and quiet, knowing this was more than learning a skill. It was the beginning of reclaiming himself. As I stood behind him, I thought about how families can fall apart in silence, not with shouts, but with sighs swallowed too long. Yet even broken families can find rhythm again when someone chooses to stay. When we turned off the lights that night, the house felt different, lighter, as if it had finally exhaled. By early spring, our days started to find a rhythm. Mason woke up to the smell of pancakes. Daniel brewed coffee without being asked, and the house finally sounded like a home again. The sewing room became the heart of our recovery. Morning light poured through the window, dust floating in golden ribbons as if the air itself wanted to help. Daniel spent hours there, sorting fabrics by color and folding them into careful stacks. I would sit beside him, hemming a dress or repairing a neighbor's old coat, watching the focus return to his face. One morning, I caught him humming, softly, the same tune he used to sing when Mason was a baby. It was the sound of a man remembering himself. Mason had adapted to school better than anyone expected. His teacher called one afternoon to tell me he'd written an essay about the bravest person I know. It was about Daniel. When I read it aloud, Daniel's hands trembled so badly he had to set down the cup he was holding. He said, "He thinks I'm brave?" I told him, "Because you are." Sometimes courage doesn't roar. Sometimes it just keeps showing up every morning. Still, there were days when Daniel's confidence wavered. I'd find him staring out the kitchen window, watching the mailman or the neighbor's truck, lost in a fog of self-doubt. "Ma," he asked once, "what if I can't give Mason the life he deserves?" I took his hand, rough and scarred, and said, "You already are. You came back. You fight every day to stay honest. That's the kind of life any child deserves." Around that time, an order came in from a local daycare. They needed costumes for a children's play, little jackets, skirts, and capes. My wrist still ached from old arthritis, so Daniel offered to help. At first I hesitated. The patterns were delicate, the seams tricky. But when he started cutting, I saw how careful his hands had become, how patient. The needle sang through the fabric in even strokes. He spent the whole night working. By morning, the table was covered with small garments, tiny superhero capes, dresses with crooked hearts sewn on the front, little pants stitched with bright yellow thread. They were imperfect, but full of joy. When Mason woke up and saw them, he clapped and shouted, "Daddy made these?" Daniel nodded, his eyes shining with pride and disbelief. We delivered the clothes to the daycare that afternoon. The children squealed when they tried them on. One teacher, a kind woman named Nora, took pictures and asked where we'd gotten them. "Homemade," I said. "My son made them." That sentence carried a warmth I hadn't felt in years. Within days, Nora shared the photos online. Orders began trickling in, parents asking for special outfits, matching hats and tiny vests. Daniel panicked at first, muttering that it must be a mistake. But when the doorbell rang with another delivery, I saw something awaken in him: hope. We cleared space in the living room, moved the sewing machine to a bigger table, and wrote a sign for the wall. Mason printed it in block letters, "Little Threads of Hope." The name felt right. Every stitch Daniel sewed carried a piece of our healing. The neighbors who once whispered began to smile when they passed by. Some even stopped to order clothes. It was strange how quickly judgment turned into admiration once success arrived. I didn't care. All that mattered was that Daniel's hands had purpose again. One evening, Mason asked if he could design a logo for the business. He drew a needle looping through a heart. Daniel taped it to the door. For the first time since Sabrina's betrayal, laughter filled our home without feeling borrowed. I remember sitting on the porch that night, watching the sunset paint the snowmelt gold. Daniel joined me, holding 2 mugs of cocoa. He said, "You ever think happiness could come from something this small?" I smiled. "Happiness doesn't come small," I said. "We just forget how to see it." When the wind picked up, I thought about how far we had come since that day under the bridge. Pain had not vanished, but it had softened, turned into fabric we could live inside. The orders kept coming, faster than we could keep up. What began as a handful of requests turned into daily phone calls and handwritten notes slipped through our mailbox. Can you make matching Easter dresses? Do you do baby quilts? Could I come by to see your designs? Daniel laughed every time the phone rang, shaking his head as if life were finally apologizing for all it had taken. He spent long hours in the sewing room, music low, scissors clicking, Mason sitting nearby coloring or handing him spools of thread. I watched from the doorway, my heart swelling at the sight of them working side by side. There was dignity in that room, the kind you earn through pain, not inheritance. One afternoon, while I was out buying fabric, a local newspaper photographer stopped by. Nora, the daycare teacher, had told them about the father and son business started from a kitchen table of courage. They took a picture of Daniel and Mason smiling behind a mountain of colorful clothes. When the article came out, our phone rang non-stop for 2 days. "Mom," Daniel said, looking stunned, "people actually like what I make." "They don't just like it," I said. "They see themselves in it. You're sowing second chances." He laughed, but there were tears in his eyes. For the first time in years, I saw him hold his shoulders straight. The shame that once bent his spine began to lift. He even started teaching Mason how to use the pedal on the machine. I warned him that a 10-year-old's patience was shorter than thread, but Mason surprised us both. He guided the fabric slowly, tongue between his teeth, so focused that Daniel whispered, "He's better than I was." It was around then that I realized how healing often hides inside small motions, the way Daniel's fingers smoothed fabric, the way Mason leaned against his father's side without fear. The house, once a place of loss, had become a shelter for courage. But healing is never quiet for long. Success has a way of stirring ghosts. One gray Saturday, I found a letter on the porch. No return address. The handwriting was familiar. Elegant, sharp, confident. My stomach tightened before I even opened it. Sabrina. The note was short. I heard Daniel's doing well. Mason deserves to know his mother. I'll be in town next week. I didn't tell Daniel right away. I carried the letter in my apron pocket for a full day, the words burning against my side. Part of me hoped she would forget, that she was bluffing, but by Tuesday, a sleek car pulled into the driveway. She stepped out in a white coat, heels clicking on the pavement like punctuation marks. Mason was playing in the yard when he saw her, his face lit up in confusion. "Mom?" he called. Daniel rushed out, stopping cold when he saw her. His hands clenched, his jaw tightened, every scar inside him waking up at once. Sabrina smiled as if nothing had happened. "You look good, Daniel," she said. "Better than I expected." I stood in the doorway, my chest burning with old rage. She had aged beautifully, of course. New hair color, polished nails, expensive perfume. Pain never seems to leave marks on those who cause it. She crouched to Mason's height and opened her arms. "I've missed you, sweetheart," she said. Mason froze, looking at his father for permission. Daniel whispered, "It's okay," though his voice trembled. The boy stepped forward slowly. She hugged him tightly, her eyes flicking toward me over his shoulder. Triumph glimmered there, the kind that feeds on forgiveness it doesn't deserve. When she finally left that afternoon, Daniel was shaking. "Why now?" he asked. I had no answer. Some people return not out of love, but to reclaim control. That night, Mason asked if his mother would be staying. Daniel told him no, but the uncertainty in his tone made my stomach twist. I knew this peace we'd built was about to be tested. The woman who had abandoned them wasn't done taking. Before going to bed, I unfolded her letter one more time and whispered to myself, "Not this time." Sabrina's return felt like a storm creeping in from far away. You could smell it before it hit. Daniel tried to act calm, but I saw how his hands shook when the phone rang, how he double-checked the locks before bed. Mason asked questions in the soft, uncertain way children do when they sense adults are lying. "Is Mom mad at us?" he asked one night. Daniel knelt down and said, "No, buddy, she's just confused." I wanted to say the truth, That confusion was the kindest word we could give her, but I bit my tongue. The next week, Sabrina began showing up everywhere. She stopped by the shop just to see Mason. She sent cupcakes to the school. She even mailed a bouquet to the house with a note that read, "You'll always be my family." Each gesture was polished, calculated, and hollow. Daniel's confidence began to slip again, thread by thread. One afternoon, she appeared at the store wearing sunglasses and a smile that could slice glass. "I just wanted to talk," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an answer. I stood near the counter, arms folded. Daniel looked trapped between politeness and fury. She ran her fingers over the children's clothes displayed on the wall. "These are adorable," she said. "So this is what you've been doing? Using my idea?" "Your idea?" I asked, keeping my tone even. "Well," she said, "we sold everything to start over, didn't we? This business exists because of that money. Technically, I invested first." Daniel took a step forward. "You abandoned us," he said quietly. "You left Mason and me with nothing." Sabrina tilted her head, pretending to be wounded. "You make it sound so dramatic. I just needed time to find myself." Her words burned through the room. I wanted to shout, but Daniel raised his hand slightly, as if to ask me to stay back. He said, "You found yourself by stealing our lives." She smiled again, cool and dismissive. "The world doesn't care about sob stories, Daniel. You should be thanking me for giving you the push to start something. You're finally successful, right? Let's not pretend you did it all alone." When she left, Mason was in the back room, drawing quietly. He looked up at Daniel's face and asked, "Is Mom angry?" Daniel said, "No, she's just trying to remember who she is." But I saw his jaw tighten. That night, over dinner, he barely ate. "She's going to try something," he said. "I can feel it." I nodded. "Then we'll be ready." 2 days later, the papers arrived, an official custody petition. Sabrina wanted Mason back. She claimed Daniel was emotionally unstable and financially dependent on his mother. I felt the blood drain from my face as I read the words. Every line was twisted truth. She knew exactly how to make a wound look like evidence. Daniel's first instinct was to give up. "She'll win," he said, gripping his hair. "She always wins." I put my hands on his shoulders. "Not this time. Not when the truth is on our side." We spent that night going through every photograph, every message, every scrap of memory that proved her abandonment. Mason slept between us on the couch, clutching his stuffed dog, unaware of the storm building around him. The next morning, I called an old friend from church who worked as a paralegal. She recommended an attorney, Louis Garner, an older man known for taking difficult family cases. When we met him, he listened without interrupting, just nodding slowly as Daniel told the story. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "You have more than a case," he said. "You have the truth, and I intend to make the court see it." For the first time in days, Daniel's eyes cleared a little. Hope, fragile but visible, returned. That evening, as I folded laundry, I caught a glimpse of our reflection in the window. 3 figures against the fading light, bruised but unbroken. I thought about all the years I had spent teaching Mason how to mend fabric, how to keep seams from splitting. Life was not so different. You reinforce what has been torn, one careful stitch at a time. The next chapter of our lives would be a fight, but this time, we had more than pain. We had purpose. Attorney Lewis met us early on a Monday morning in his downtown office, a quiet space that smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. He had a calm, steady manner that made Daniel breathe easier just by sitting across from him. Mason played quietly with a set of toy cars in the corner while Lewis reviewed the custody documents. His eyebrows rose as he flipped through the pages. "She's confident," he said. "But confidence isn't proof." Daniel leaned forward, hands clasped. "She's good at pretending," he said. "She'll make them believe I'm unfit." Lewis adjusted his glasses and answered, "Then we'll show them what truth looks like." We began gathering evidence that same day. I found the old email where Sabrina told me not to look for them, The bank records showing every dollar transferred to her account and messages Daniel had saved. Desperate texts she never answered. Lewis told us to keep everything, even the small details. Judges don't always need drama, he said. They need consistency. The following week, Sabrina filed another motion, this time demanding half of the business profits. It was her way of attacking Daniel's pride. "She's trying to humiliate you," I told him. "Don't give her the satisfaction." He nodded, though I saw the fear in his eyes. Every time the mail arrived, he flinched. Mason felt the tension too. He started sleeping in my room again, saying he dreamed that someone was taking him away. I would stroke his hair and tell him no one could steal love that was real. Still, when he hugged Daniel in the morning, he held on a little longer. One evening, while Daniel and I sat sorting receipts for Lewis, Mason came in carrying a drawing. It showed 3 stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. "This is us," he said proudly. I taped it above the sewing table like a banner. We needed that picture more than we needed any certificate. The first court hearing arrived faster than we expected. Sabrina entered the courtroom dressed like a movie star, her lawyer carrying a briefcase that probably cost more than my car. She greeted the judge with a polished smile and turned toward Daniel with feigned sympathy. "I only want what's best for Mason," she said. Daniel's voice trembled when he spoke, but his words were clean. "You left us under a bridge," he said quietly. "You didn't check if we were alive." A hush filled the room. Even the judge's pen stopped moving for a moment. Sabrina's lawyer objected, but Lewis remained calm. He introduced the evidence one piece at a time: the bank transfers, the messages, the email. He spoke with precision, not anger, letting truth carry its own weight. When I took the stand, my hands shook, but my voice stayed firm. I told the court how Daniel had rebuilt his life, how Mason had flourished, and how love, not money, was what held our family together. Sabrina's face hardened as I spoke. She tried to interrupt, saying I was biased. The judge silenced her with a raised hand. For the first time, she didn't control the room. Afterward, outside the courthouse, Daniel leaned against the railing, pale but steady. "I think she's scared," he said. "Good," I answered. "She should be, not of losing, but of facing herself." That night, we went home and worked side by side in the sewing room. The familiar hum of the machine soothed the tension. Mason curled up on the couch, watching us until he drifted to sleep. The pile of finished clothes grew higher, and with each stitch, I could feel Daniel reclaiming a little more of his confidence. When we finally stopped to rest, Daniel said, "Do you ever think life waits for the right moment to test us?" I looked at him and smiled. Life doesn't wait. It just gives you another chance to prove who you are. Outside, snow began to fall softly against the window. I took Mason's drawing from the wall and looked at the 3 smiling figures. We were still together. That was proof enough for me. Winter settled over St. Paul again, heavy and quiet, as if the city itself were holding its breath. The second hearing was scheduled for January, and every day leading up to it felt like walking on ice that might crack. Daniel grew thinner from nerves, though he tried to hide it by keeping busy. He worked long hours at the shop, finishing orders he could barely focus on. I worried, but I knew he needed movement. The stillness reminded him too much of the years he had lost. Sabrina, on the other hand, seemed to thrive on the chaos. Her lawyer filed new motions almost weekly, each more absurd than the last. One claimed Daniel was emotionally dependent on his elderly mother. Another suggested Mason's environment lacked stability. I laughed bitterly when I read that one. Stability, I thought, was something Sabrina couldn't spell if her life depended on it. Attorney Lewis stayed steady through it all. "Let her overplay her hand," he said. Judges noticed desperation. Still, I could see the toll on Daniel. He woke at dawn, sat on the porch with his head in his hands, and whispered prayers I pretended not to hear. One night, Mason came into my room, dragging his blanket behind him. "Grandma," he asked, "will they make me live somewhere else?" I pulled him close and told him no. But deep down, fear had already built its own small house inside my chest. To distract Mason, I started teaching him how to quilt. We stitched together squares from leftover fabric, one blue for his father, one yellow for him, and one red for me. Every family has its pattern, I told him. Ours is courage. He smiled, proud of his crooked stitches. That quilt became our shield, a promise that no matter what the court decided, love would hold. The night before the second hearing, Daniel couldn't sleep. He paced the living room until I made tea and forced him to sit. "She's going to twist everything," he said. "She'll make me look like I failed Mason." I took his hand and said, "She can't take what's already healed. You are not the man she left. You're the man who stayed." When morning came, we dressed in quiet determination. Mason wore a little tie he'd insisted on, his hair neatly combed. Daniel's suit hung loose on him, but his eyes were clear. As we drove to the courthouse, frost glittered on the trees like fragile glass. I remember thinking how beautiful survival can look when you're still standing after the storm. Inside, Sabrina sat at her table with that same polished composure, as if the last few years had been nothing more than a misunderstanding. She looked at Mason and smiled sweetly, the same way a snake studies a bird. My stomach turned. Lewis began the questioning calmly, guiding Daniel through his testimony. Daniel spoke about the years of silence, the nights he spent keeping Mason warm, the day I found them under the bridge. His voice wavered once, but he didn't break. He looked directly at the judge and said, "I am not perfect, but I never stopped being a father." Then came Sabrina's turn. Her story changed with every sentence. Sometimes she was a victim, sometimes a savior, sometimes a saint who had been misunderstood. Lewis asked her simple questions, and she twisted each one into a performance. But lies are like weak stitches. They unravel under pressure. Halfway through, the judge interrupted her mid-sentence. "You abandoned your family, correct?" he asked. Her mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, she had no script. Outside the courtroom afterward, Daniel exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for years. Mason ran to him, wrapping his arms around his waist. "We did good, right?" he asked. Daniel smiled. "We told the truth," he said. "That's all that matters." That night, back home, we lit candles on the kitchen table. The house smelled of cinnamon and fabric softener, and for a moment, peace returned. Mason hung our quilt over the couch like a flag. It wasn't the end, but it was the calm before the verdict. A fragile, beautiful pause that felt like mercy. The verdict hearing was set for early February, and the morning of, St. Paul was wrapped in a pale fog. It was the kind of quiet that makes you whisper, even indoors. Daniel moved around the kitchen like a man rehearsing his last confession. He barely touched his breakfast. Mason sat at the table swinging his legs, wearing the same tie from the last hearing. I ironed my blouse twice, just to have something to do with my hands. Before we left, Daniel paused at the sewing table. He touched Mason's drawing, the one with the 3 stick figures, and whispered, "For luck." I placed my hand on his shoulder. "For truth," I corrected. The courthouse felt colder that day. The marble floor echoed with the sound of footsteps and nerves. Sabrina was already there, immaculate as always, her lawyer whispering in her ear. She barely looked at Daniel, which somehow hurt more than her cruelty. Ignoring someone you destroyed is its own kind of violence. When the judge entered, everyone stood. He spoke slowly, deliberately, the way men do when they know their words will change lives. "I have reviewed the testimony and evidence," he began. "This is not a simple case of disagreement. This is a case about responsibility." My breath caught. Daniel gripped the table. The judge continued, "It is evident that the father has provided a stable, nurturing environment for the child. The evidence also shows the mother willingly abandoned both her husband and son for several years, making minimal effort to contact them. Therefore, the court grants full custody of Mason Hart to his father, Daniel Hart." I didn't realize I had been holding my breath until Mason squealed, "We won!" The courtroom blurred. Daniel's head fell into his hands, shoulders shaking in silent relief. Even Lewis smiled, which for a man like him meant celebration. Sabrina stood frozen for a moment, disbelief twisting her face. Then she turned sharply, her heels clicking as she stormed out. I watched her leave, and for the first time, I felt no anger, only pity. The freedom she had chased had turned into emptiness, while ours had turned into a home. Outside the courthouse, snow was falling again, soft and steady. Daniel lifted Mason into his arms, spinning him once before setting him down. "You're staying with me, champ," he said. Mason grinned, teeth flashing like sunlight on ice. Lewis shook Daniel's hand. "You did good," he said simply. "Now go live the life you fought for." We thanked him, then drove home in near silence. Every few blocks, Mason would whisper, "We did it," and Daniel would nod, still dazed. Back home I made soup, while Daniel and Mason hung their coats. The house felt different, lighter, warmer, like it had been waiting to exhale. I ladled soup into bowls, my hands trembling just enough to spill a little. Daniel took his bowl and said, "Ma, I don't know how to thank you." "You already did," I said. "You kept going." That night, after Mason was asleep, Daniel and I sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the snow settle over the yard. The air smelled of pine and smoke from a neighbor's chimney. "I thought I'd never get here," Daniel said softly. "I thought dignity was something you lose forever once someone takes it." I turned to him. "Dignity isn't a gift someone gives you. It's what's left when you decide to stand up again." He nodded, his breath visible in the cold. "I want to make the shop bigger. Maybe teach others to sew, people who need a second chance like I did." "That's the best kind of success," I said. "The kind that gives." We sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind, letting the weight of the last few years finally lift. Inside, the sewing machine gleamed faintly in the light from the kitchen window. It wasn't just a tool anymore. It was proof that broken lives can be pieced together into something whole. When I finally went to bed, I stopped by Mason's room. He slept with the quilt pulled up to his chin, his small hand resting on the red square. Our square of courage. I kissed his forehead and whispered a quiet promise. We were finally safe. Life after the verdict felt almost unreal. The first week, we moved through the days as if afraid to disturb the peace. Daniel kept expecting another letter, another surprise motion, another way for Sabrina to claw back into our lives. But nothing came. Her silence was its own kind of surrender. Word spread quickly around St. Paul. Neighbors who once looked away now stopped to congratulate Daniel. Orders for little threads of hope tripled within a month. The local paper ran a follow-up article calling it "A Story of Resilience Stitched from Heartbreak." People started sending letters from other states, mothers, grandmothers, single fathers, all saying our story reminded them that it's never too late to rebuild. Daniel was overwhelmed. "I never thought anyone would care about what I make," he said. I told him, "They don't just care about the clothes, Daniel. They care about the courage behind them." We expanded the shop into the front room. Mason had his own corner now, where he made small, hand-sewn toys and sold them for pocket change. He named his little collection Mason's Miracles. The boy had his father's hands, steady, patient, curious. Sometimes I'd catch them working side by side, heads bent over matching stitches, the hum of the machine and the murmur of their voices blending into something that sounded like prayer. On weekends, Daniel began volunteering at a local shelter, teaching basic sewing to people trying to get back on their feet. He said it was his way of paying forward the kindness that saved him. Watching him teach others how to mend fabric and hope in the same breath was something holy. Still, there were moments when the past knocked softly. A familiar perfume in a grocery aisle, a song Sabrina used to hum on the radio. Daniel would tense for a moment, then exhale. One evening, he said, "Do you think forgiveness is supposed to feel peaceful?" I thought about it and answered, "Forgiveness isn't peace. It's permission to stop bleeding." Spring came early that year. Mason turned 11, and we threw a small party in the backyard with cupcakes and string lights. Daniel stood near the fence, watching his son laugh, and said, "I think he's finally free." I smiled. "So are you." Later that night, As we cleaned up, Daniel found a letter tucked inside Mason's backpack. It was from Sabrina. Short, handwritten, almost gentle. "I'm sorry. I hope one day you can tell him I tried to love the right way." Daniel read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer. "I'm done chasing ghosts," he said. "Let her find her own peace." I watched him close that drawer, and it felt like watching a door lock behind years of pain. We didn't need revenge or apologies anymore. Justice had already done its part. What we needed now was ordinary life, the kind filled with laughter, chores, and the smell of fabric softener. By summer, the business had grown enough that Daniel hired 2 local women to help with orders. They laughed and gossiped as they worked, bringing music into the shop. Mason liked to sit by the window, sketching new designs, talking about someday running his own line. Daniel looked at him with quiet pride, a father finally able to dream for his son instead of just survive for him. One warm evening, as I watered the garden, Daniel came outside carrying a finished quilt. It was beautiful, soft blues and greens stitched with gold thread. "For you," he said. "You gave us everything." I unfolded it and ran my hands over the fabric. In one corner, he'd sewn a small label that read, "Thank you for not giving up." I felt my throat tighten. "You did all the work, Daniel," I said. He smiled. "You taught me how to start again." That night, wrapped in that quilt, I sat by the window listening to the crickets. The house, once haunted by loss, now hummed with life. I realized that love doesn't erase scars, it just teaches you how to live with them gracefully. Summer turned into a soft, golden autumn. The maple trees around St. Paul blazed red and gold, and the air smelled like warm apples and new beginnings. Mason was thriving. His teacher said he was one of the most creative students in the class, full of empathy and kindness. He had started drawing designs for new clothes, proudly showing them to anyone who would look. Daniel laughed and said, "Looks like we've got another heart in the family business." I watched them together from the porch, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Pure gratitude. The fear and chaos that had ruled our lives for so long had finally given way to calm. But peace, I learned, doesn't mean stillness. It means being strong enough to face life without flinching. One Sunday, Daniel announced he wanted to open a small storefront downtown. "I found a space near the park," he said, excitement lighting up his face. "We could move the sewing machines there, make it official." I studied him for a moment, the way his voice carried certainty now, not doubt. "Then do it," I said. "You've already built it with your hands. The rest is just paperwork." It took weeks of planning and saving, but soon little threads of hope had a sign on a real window. Mason helped paint the letters. The day they opened, the front door jingled constantly. People came from across town, neighbors, teachers, even strangers who had read about Daniel's story. The air buzzed with joy and disbelief. I stood behind the counter, watching my son greet customers with confidence. He showed them the children's clothes he had designed, each one sewn with quiet purpose. He talked about sustainability, local production, and teaching kindness through fabric. I could hardly believe this was the same man who once hid his face in shame beneath a bridge. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Daniel locked the door, turned off the lights, and stood in the dark shop with Mason on his hip. "We did it, Ma," he said softly. "We really did." "Yes," I said. "But remember, success is not what you earn, it's who you become." In the following months, the shop flourished. Mason's drawings became a little line of handmade toys displayed near the register. Customers left notes on the counter, stories of their own recoveries, of families mended and spirits rekindled. Some even brought old garments, asking Daniel to repurpose them into something new. He called it his second chance collection. But even as joy filled our days, I never forgot the shadows we'd walked through. There were moments, quiet, unexpected ones, when I'd wake up at night and remember the bridge, the cold, the smell of damp concrete. I would lie in bed listening to the steady hum of the city, reminding myself that the worst was behind us. One evening, Mason came home from school with a question that stopped me mid-stitch. "Grandma," he asked, "why did Mom leave?" I took a deep breath. Because some people don't know how to love the right way, I said. He thought about it for a moment, then nodded slowly. But we still do, right? I smiled and kissed the top of his head. Always. That night, Daniel joined me on the porch with 2 mugs of cocoa. He asked about her, didn't he? He said quietly. He's old enough to wonder, I replied. Just tell him the truth, but tell it gently. Daniel looked out over the yard. You think I should forgive her? I thought for a long time before answering. Forgiveness isn't something you owe her. It's something you give yourself when you're ready to stop carrying her mistakes. He nodded, eyes glistening. Then I guess I'm almost ready. The wind carried the scent of leaves and pine through the evening air. I felt peace settle around us, not as a gift, but as something earned. I looked at my son and grandson and realized that justice had given us more than victory. It had given us restoration. By the time winter came around again, little threads of hope had become a small miracle in our corner of St. Paul. The shop buzzed with laughter, the smell of fabric, and the low hum of conversation that only happens in places built from love. The walls were covered with photos of children wearing Daniel's clothes, and Mason proudly told customers which designs were his. The business was modest, but it had heart, and in our family, that meant everything. Daniel started hiring from the community center, women and men trying to rebuild their lives after hardship. One was a young mother leaving an abusive marriage. Another, a veteran, learning to use his hands again after years of silence. Daniel taught them not just how to sew, but how to trust themselves. I watched from my usual seat near the back, pretending to read the newspaper while my heart filled with pride. In the evenings, the shop turned into something more than a workplace. It became a gathering place. People brought food, stories, and sometimes their own quiet griefs. Daniel always listened without judgment. Mason set up a small donation jar labeled "For Families Who Need a New Start." Within a month, it overflowed. One Friday, a woman approached me outside the shop. Her voice trembled as she said, "Your son gave my brother a job. He was sleeping in his car before this." She handed me a folded note for Daniel that simply read, "Thank you for believing I still had worth." I carried it home like treasure. That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table after everyone went to bed. The sound of the clock ticking reminded me of all the nights I had stayed up worrying, all the prayers I had whispered into the dark. I unfolded that note again and thought about the strange way life circles back, how something born out of betrayal could grow into a source of hope for others. When Daniel came in from closing the shop, I told him about the woman's brother. He smiled softly. "That's the best payment we could ever get," he said. "Someone believing in themselves again." I nodded. "You've turned pain into purpose, Daniel. That's real wealth." He looked at me for a long time, then said, "You know, I used to think freedom meant leaving. Now I think it means staying and building something worth coming home to." Later, Mason came in, half asleep, dragging his quilt behind him. "Can we sew tomorrow?" he asked. Daniel scooped him up, smiling. "Always," he said. Watching them together, I realized the boy would never remember the bridge, the hunger, or the fear. He would only remember the sound of his father's laughter and the safety of our home. That winter, I joined Daniel at the shop again, sewing small patches for the Second Chance collection. Customers began asking for the story behind each item, so Daniel printed a card that read, "Every stitch here belongs to someone who chose courage instead of giving up." One afternoon, as we locked up for the day, the sun dipped behind the frozen rooftops, turning the city gold. Daniel wrapped his arm around my shoulder. "Ma," he said, "you think Dad would be proud?" I smiled through the ache in my chest. He always believed in doing the right thing. I think he's watching. We walked home together, snow crunching under our boots. Mason ran ahead, his laughter echoing down the quiet street. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of the past pressing behind me. I felt it walking beside me, gentle, forgiven, part of who we were, but no longer defining us. When we reached the porch, Daniel turned off the porch light and said, "Tomorrow's going to be busy, 3 new orders already. I laughed. Good. Keep your hands full. It keeps your heart honest. As we went inside, I looked back at the faint light still glowing from the shop window across the street. It wasn't just a business anymore. It was proof that even the darkest chapters can be rewritten with patience, courage, and a needle that never stops moving forward. It was strange how calm life felt after so many years of surviving in chaos. There were no more court dates, no letters from lawyers, no shadows waiting at the door. The silence that once felt like danger now sounded like peace. Every morning, sunlight spilled across the kitchen table, glinting off Mason's cereal spoon as Daniel read the newspaper aloud. The world was ordinary again, and that was its own kind of miracle. I spent my days helping at the shop or tending to my garden behind the house. Daniel teased me for talking to the tomato plants. "You treat them like grandchildren," he said, and I told him, "They listen better." He laughed, and I realized how long it had been since laughter came so easily to him. Sometimes customers would ask about our story. Daniel told them pieces, careful not to dwell on the pain. "We went through a rough patch," he'd say, "but we found our way back." People always nodded as if they understood. Maybe they did. Everyone carries something they don't speak of. As for me, I had more time to think about age, boundaries, freedom, and the strange balance between love and self-respect. I used to believe that being a mother meant saying yes to everything, even when it hurt. I gave and gave and gave until I was empty. Now I understand that love without limits turns you into a ghost in your own life. Dignity isn't selfish, it's sacred. When Daniel first came home, broken and ashamed, I had been afraid of setting rules, afraid he'd feel judged. But healing needs boundaries the way fabric needs seams. Too loose, and it unravels. Too tight, and it tears. It took me nearly 70 years to understand that lesson. One afternoon, a young woman came into the shop crying. Her husband had left, taking their savings. She said she'd heard about Daniel and wanted a job. Daniel looked at me, and I nodded. He taught her how to measure fabric, how to press seams flat, how to start small. Watching him guide her with patience and respect, I saw the full circle of our story. We had gone from victims to witnesses of resilience. Later that night, I wrote in my journal, "Strength isn't loud. It's quiet hands doing the next right thing." Mason was growing fast. He wanted to play baseball, learn guitar, and design clothes all at once. Daniel and I took turns trying to keep up with his energy. One evening, he asked, "Grandma, are you proud of Dad?" I looked across the room where Daniel was sketching new patterns and said, "Every day." Mason grinned. "Me too." There was one more thing I needed to do before I could call the past complete. I found Sabrina's last letter, the one Daniel had tucked away, and read it one final time. "I'm sorry. I hope one day you can tell him I tried to love the right way." Her handwriting trembled near the end, as if regret had finally caught up to her. I folded it neatly and placed it in a small box with the court papers and photos. Our history, preserved but no longer heavy. Then I burned a copy in the fireplace. The flame flickered blue and gold before disappearing into ash. "Goodbye," I whispered. Daniel found me there and said, "It's time to let go, isn't it?" "It was time a long time ago," I said. "Now it's just peace catching up." We sat together watching the last ember fade. The house was quiet, but not empty. Mason's laughter drifted from his room, muffled by walls that had seen everything and still stood. As I looked at my son, I realized that freedom isn't leaving or staying, it's knowing you have a choice. We had chosen compassion over revenge, truth over pride, life over bitterness. When we went to bed that night, I turned off the lamp and thought of the bridge where it all began. What once symbolized loss had become a reminder of how far we had walked. Some bridges aren't meant to cross again. They're meant to remind you where not to go back. The first snow of December fell softly over St. Paul, blanketing the streets in white. From my porch, I could see the lights glowing through the shop window across the street. Daniel and Mason were still working late, finishing a batch of holiday orders. Their silhouettes moved together, steady and sure, like a rhythm the world had finally learned to keep. I wrapped my shawl tighter and watched them, feeling that rare, quiet satisfaction that comes only when life has come full circle. There was no noise now, no shouting, no begging the universe for mercy, just the calm pulse of survival turned into purpose. Inside, the house was warm. The smell of cinnamon tea and old fabric lingered in the air. I sat at the kitchen table and opened my old sewing box, the one I had nearly thrown away years ago. Inside were pieces of thread from every season of our lives, frayed blues, hopeful yellows, stubborn reds. I took one of each and began stitching them together, not into a garment, but into a small square of memory. It wasn't meant to be useful. It was meant to remember. When Daniel came home, snow still glittering on his coat, he smiled. "You're still sewing?" "Always," I said. "There's still beauty left to hold together." He sat across from me, his hands rough but steady. "I was thinking," he said, "next year I might expand, hire a few more people, maybe open a second shop." "You've earned it," I said. "But promise me one thing. Don't lose what made you start." "What's that?" "Heart." He smiled, then reached across the table and took my hand. "You gave me that," he said quietly. Mason ran in a few minutes later, cheeks red from the cold, holding a small handmade ornament. "Grandma, look, it's a bridge." It was made from twigs and silver thread, simple and beautiful. "Why a bridge?" I asked. "So we don't forget where we came from," he said. My throat tightened. I hugged him close, feeling the warmth of his small body against mine. "That's perfect, sweetheart, just perfect." We hung the ornament on the tree together. The lights reflected off the silver thread, shimmering like hope itself. For a moment, the room was filled with a stillness that felt holy. Later that night, when Mason was asleep, Daniel and I sat by the fire. The flames danced in the reflection of the window, and snow continued to fall outside, silent and endless. "Do you ever think about her?" Daniel asked quietly. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but not with anger anymore. With understanding. People like Sabrina teach us the cost of forgetting what love is supposed to mean." He nodded. "I don't hate her anymore either. I just wish her peace." "That's how you know you're free," I said. He looked into the fire for a long time before whispering, "You saved me." I shook my head. "No, Daniel, you saved yourself. I just kept the door open." The fire crackled softly. The years of heartbreak, courtrooms, and cold mornings seemed to dissolve into the quiet warmth around us. I felt the weight of my age, but also the gift of it, the ability to look back without bitterness, to see pain not as a curse, but as proof that we endured. When I went to bed, I paused at the window. Across the street, the shop sign glowed faintly under the snow. Little threads of hope. The name still made me smile. It wasn't just a business, it was a map of everything we had survived. Before turning off the light, I whispered a small prayer, not for more years, but for more meaning in the ones left. For strength to keep loving, forgiving, and starting over, no matter how late in life it comes. Because that's what family truly is, the courage to keep sewing the torn pieces together, even when the thread runs thin. I look back on it now and realize that nothing about our journey was ordinary. It began under a bridge, in the cold shadow of betrayal, and somehow ended in the warm light of redemption. Life doesn't hand out justice neatly. It makes you fight for it, stitch by stitch, until you remember your own worth. Daniel and Mason taught me that strength doesn't come from never falling. It comes from standing up again when no one believes you can. For years, I thought I had failed as a mother, that I had watched helplessly as my family crumbled. But what I learned is that love has no expiration date. You can begin again at 68 or 75 because the heart never stops wanting to heal. There were moments when I nearly lost faith in goodness. Watching my son under that bridge broke something in me that I thought would never mend. Yet love, when it is patient and humble, has a way of turning broken things into beginnings. Our story is proof of that. St. Paul still feels the same bridges, the same icy wind, but it doesn't hurt to walk by them anymore. When I passed the spot where I found Daniel and Mason, I whisper a small thank you, not to the pain, but to the strength that grew from it. Daniel's shop continues to grow. The sign, Little Threads of Hope, hangs proudly downtown. Mason, now 11 and dreaming bigger every day, says he wants to design clothes that make people feel safe. I tell him he already does. As for me, I spend my mornings sewing small quilts for the shelter, gifts for families trying to start over. Every square I stitch carries a silent prayer. May they find warmth faster than we did. I have learned that dignity is not something others grant you. It's the quiet decision to honor your truth no matter how small it feels. Freedom isn't escape. It's living with integrity after the storm. Boundaries aren't walls, they're lines of respect drawn from love. And forgiveness, oh forgiveness, is not letting someone back into your life. It's releasing their power to poison the days you have left. I don't hate Sabrina anymore. I simply wish her peace, because wishing her pain would only chain me to her forever. When people ask how I survived, I tell them the truth. I didn't survive alone. I survived through my son's courage, my grandson's laughter, and the stubborn heartbeat that refuses to stop hoping. Life broke us open, but it also let the light in. So if you are listening to this and your family feels lost, if betrayal has stolen your sleep and your pride feels threadbare, remember this: you can begin again. You can build from nothing but love and will. You can sew your life back together, one truth, one act of kindness, one breath at a time. Because even after the harshest winter, there's always another morning. And sometimes that morning begins with a bridge, a blanket, and the simple, sacred word that saves everything: home. If this story touched your heart, please like the video and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next one. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Your support helps keep these voices alive. And if you are ready for another powerful journey, click the story appearing on your screen right now. See you in the next life story with love and respect.